lecture in the Vibrant Gujarat India lecture series launched by the Chief Minister. We are all characterized by what the philosopher David Hume called concentric circles of loyalty and affection and affinity. It is in fact a remarkable state in many ways. I shall come to your wonderful leadership in a moment. First, in regard to arts, sciences and commerce, to be a Gujarati is to belong to a community that is distinguished not just in commerce, but also in arts and sciences. If I just took a quick view of all the major figures which come to mind when one thinks of Gujaratis in public sphere, in the arts and sciences. In music, we had Vilat Hussain Khan and Omkarnath Thakur. Among the scientists, from right here, Vikram Sarabhai, Miss Homi Bhabha. The Parsis, as you know, came from Persia and became Gujaratis in effect. A very beloved community within our midst. Then there are major entrepreneurs, Tatas, Ambanis, Azim Premji, I could just go on and on and on. Finance, you've got Deepak Parekh, Uday Kotak, again a whole slew of people, very eminent people in these fields. And then of course social entrepreneurs and civil society NGOs, of whom the most eminent of course is Ilavan Bhatt in Seva, who should have had actually the Nobel Prize in my opinion, because she came through with the self-employed women's work and microfinance 2 years before Muhammad Yunus. But being a Gandhian, she was not into public relations, which actually gets to these prizes. But she's someone we can be very proud of, and she's just at the apex of the organizations in social entrepreneurship, which is really for the uplift of the very downtrodden, self-employed women. So our greatest pride, of course, is Gandhiji. There's no question about that. Once I was asked at a panel in New York, which was really on corporate social responsibility. I actually believe that we should not pass the buck on and ask the corporations to be socially responsible. I believe in what I would call personal social responsibility, which actually the Chief Minister shares very much, that each of us in our own lives should be doing social responsibility, not just leaving it to other institutions. We can exhort them, but if they fail us, well, too bad. At least we can step forward. So we had a session on corporate social responsibility, and then suddenly the question turns for some unfortunate reason, as it often happens with panels, to asking, where the next great man would come from in the current century. And so I just provoked some laughter by saying, certainly not from around here, as that is in New York. And then I said that 3 great men that I knew of in the last century were in fact from Africa, in a way. One was Nelson Mandela, the other was Kofi Annan, and the third was Gandhiji, who actually had started his work in Sangha. So I said it could very well be from Africa or India. And of course I got even more applause for that. But it's certainly something where a Gujarati actually, since we are the team of Gujarat, namely Gandhiji, had actually gone in the traditions of Gujarat, which I'll turn to in a moment, and brought out very clearly the great contribution that said that non-violence could make to be advancing the public good in several different ways. And he remains easily our most eminent figure, and I'm very happy that this hall that we work, where we are talking just now, is named after him, because he's certainly the one we most are proud of. And so I think this is, I often say that we Gujaratis are like the Jews in America, who are also into arts, sciences, commerce, and doing public good. And I often tell my Jewish friends that since we are called the good Jews, for short, that we are the good Jews and they are the bad Jews. And I think all of us would recognize as Gujaratis a very important truth, which in fact a great Jewish rabbi called Hillel once said, which was, because I'm not for myself, who will be? And if I'm not for others, what am I? And I think it's this combination of self-interest and altruism, which I think also characterizes most human beings, and certainly Gujaratis. Self-interest not in a coarse way, but simply being, not in the sense of self-love or anything like that, but simply in terms of pursuing your own selfish interest or self-centered interest, but at the same time remembering to the public good, and to have a sort of balance between these two. And people are at different ends of the spectrum. Unfortunately, some are very much into just simply self-interest. But I think most people I know are somewhere in the middle, making the choice. And I think that is something that characterizes us very much. And I think if you take the Nancy Mehta's sort of famous verse which we all know, Par dukhe upakar kare to man abhiman na aane re. So you're supposed to actually be doing something by public good, but at the same time not advertising it the way many people do now. Oh, I gave so much money for this, so much money for that. You should just do it, basically. And I think that also is a very good value which Gujarat actually propagates. And today we were just discussing with the Chief Minister all the many interesting things he's been doing for public good. And I must confess, I had no idea. And so actually I'm not even sure I should be giving this lecture. It is called Lessons from and for Gujarat. It's probably lessons from Gujarat rather than lessons for Gujarat. But anyway, I will come to it. But I think, I must say, you're, Mr. Chief Minister, in a great tradition which you are actually implementing to great advantage in advancing the public good, which I think is the essence of the Gujarati experience. I would just say that today we So once I had my notes and they all got scattered, so I was picking them up and couldn't really get to them. Then I had to just give a different speech from the one I had prepared. Just fortunately I found them I'm looking for. So the theme on which I want to talk about is the debunking several popular myths or populist myths. And here I want to sort of start by talking about basically the notion that we are into creating economic prosperity, but we have not been paying attention to social agendas at all. This is something, a charge which is led particularly in Gujarat under your stewardship as well, as you know. Namely, that we are into prosperity, that wealth creation is no good in itself, it really bypasses the poor, and in fact, this is something we need to repair. And this is something which a number of people who have been for reforms of the post-1991 variety, which I and my wife Padma and a lot of other people at the time were into advocating, that this is really for the rich. It's not really for the poor. And I think this is and that we need a different model, maybe redistribution, which is really the only way we can actually get to the agenda. So one of the typical models which is cited at us is Kerala, then Bangladesh, and the common argument is that the kinds of achievements which Gujarat has are really in the field of raising incomes, but not really advancing the agenda in terms of social objectives. And people frequently just look at the levels at which we have literacy, nutrition, infant mortality, life expectancy, etc. And the point that I'm going to make is, and I've got distributed some charts on that, is that while this is so, what you have to look at is not the levels, but the changes in that. To give just one example, Kerala, the levels at which they started before communism arrived on the scene were very high. And what you had therefore was a situation where you had very high rates of literacy, very good health indicators and so on. but the change in that is very minuscule. And the common thinking now is that if they hadn't had globalization, due to literacy and then being able to go to the Middle East on the part of the one-third Muslim population, they would never have been able to salvage the experiment or the situation. So Kerala is exactly the opposite of Gujarat in the sense that it starts at a very high level of social performance on all these dimensions, but the change in it is minuscule. We started in Gujarat, and I will be, we have distributed some charts on that. We started exactly in the opposite way, with rather low levels of performance. But if you compare Gujarat with what has happened, particularly in the last 10 years, and actually even longer, because you're also standing as Chief Minister on the shoulders of others as well, because nothing is ever a total sharp break. But you still could stand on someone's shoulders and do nothing, or you can reach out and get the prize. And so in our context here, the last 10 years have been actually those of making a dramatic difference in these achievements. And when you look at it that way, Gujarat comes out at the top, actually. Now, and I think this is something where we distributed charts on that, on the levels, and on the rate of, on the what the economists call first difference, meaning the change. And there I think we have reason to be proud of Gujarat as a model. So Gujarat is a model not just in terms of rate of growth, which is the one which is commonly cited, and frequently people just look at the levels and say we are really low, but actually if you look at what impact this has made, then you get a very different picture. And that requires not just growth, but the ability to use the growth process to be able to do these social agendas. And I'll just tell you, this is where you look at the experience in India itself as a whole. And actually in 1987 I gave the Vikram Sarabhai lecture here in Ahmedabad. I don't know which hall it was, but somewhere in Ahmedabad. And there I said there were two ways in which growth could affect poverty and the welfare of the poor. One was, if you have growth, rapid growth, it is common sense, and this is something which most economists lack, of course, but it's common sense to say that if you have growth, you will be able to pull up people into gainful employment. There's no way, except in economic models which we can always build. If you want Nobel Prizes, we have to build models which are really kind of, paradoxical, where growth creates immiseration rather than benefits and so on. But in policy making, you have to pick the right model, an approved model to think about the real problem. So the idea that growth actually impacts on the poor by creating additional jobs in a country with massive poverty, which is how we started our post-independence period, worrying about that. But that is something which we really had to embrace, that growth would directly pull people into gainful employment. One of my friends, a Polish economist who was very famous and came to India in '61, caught me in the Indian Planning Commission where I was working on how to lift the 30% at the bottom into minimum standards of living. He turned to me and said, Jagdish, the problem with India is that there are too many exploited and too few exploiters. By which he meant that if you redistributed income, there were so many claimants whom you would want to give it to that you might get one more chapati a day. That's not, in modern terminology, a sustainable solution. Meaning you've done it once and for all, it doesn't lead to additional growth, additional sustainability, and therefore it's a one-shot thing. So he said you have no option except to grow the pie, which is an American expression to say you have to grow, and thereby draw people into gainful employment. And that is in fact the strategy we had settled on, and I'm sort of associated with it because I looked at the poverty charts, income distribution charts, for Mr. Pitambar Pant, with whom I was working at the time in the Perspective Planning Division. I was on loan to him. And there I drew all these pie diagrams and what the bottom 30% were getting. There wasn't much difference, so I just told the, depending on You could take communist systems, less communist systems, capitalist systems, mixed capitalist, and there didn't seem to be much difference. So I took it on the fun that really the most effective way to get at poverty was to say, let's grow the economy. And then, of course, to that you marry other ideas, like, you're drawing people into gainful employment. So that was, growth was therefore a instrumental policy, not a target, meaning it was an instrument, with policy instrument through which we would affect poverty, right? Many people believe on the other side, on the populist side, that we wound up worshipping growth. One of my friends, Mahbub Haq from Pakistan, who was a socialist, he said, you turn GNP into a goddess. And I said, Mahbub, you're a Kashmiri Muslim, so you don't understand the way we worship goddesses in Hinduism. We don't worship them for themselves. We worship them so that we get some goodies out of them. So we are worshipping GNP, if you want to put it that way, with a view to actually affecting the poverty. So it is a strategy. It's not an end in itself. So that's the one myth which people keep propagating all the time, that somehow we fell in love with GNP. We were always in love with GNP. It's really not something to go for. And the true target should be poverty. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. Because they had debates on exactly on what should be the way to get at poverty. Because you go back to the independence movement, and you must, I'm sure you're much more familiar with this than many of us. Panditji, Gandhiji, all of them are talking about how without growth you cannot have an impact on poverty. There are endless numbers, of course. The book I'm writing on debunking myths and addressing the new challenges documents all of this in enormous length. It also documents how we were concerned with healthcare, poverty, not just poverty, but healthcare, education, and so on, the other social objectives which we now talk about in a big way, and which you are actually addressing in Gujarat quite effectively. Those were in the first 5-year plan, 51 to 56, 56 to 61 in the second plan. And I was there at that time, so I read them. We had program evaluation organizations on exactly what was happening to the enrollments and to income distribution, to poverty. You name it, it was all there. And this chapter on healthcare, which I just reread the other day as part of writing my book, that also has even a couple of paragraphs on cancer. And this is in 51 to 56. It wasn't a big deal in those days. So there's nothing that we Indians haven't thought of. This is everything we have actually neglected in implementation, more or less. And we have to find out why. So it is not that we were not concerned with these true targets, which we all should be concerned about. This is the second part of the Rabbi statement, that, if I'm not for others, who am I? Or Nassim Mehta. That was there very much at the beginning of our planning process, but it didn't work out. And so that was one, and I'll just discuss in a moment why it didn't work out, and why it's beginning to now work out. And that one is precisely what I pointed out in 1987 in the Vikram Sarabhai lecture, that aside from impacting on poverty by creating jobs, the growth itself also leads to revenues at any given tax rate. Because if the system isn't growing, you don't get additional revenue. So as my friend, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh used to say, because we went to college together in 1954, 56 in Cambridge. We were in the same corridor. And he was a very simple man, very much like you, Chief Minister. And he was the first person to be educated in his, from his family. And he had come a year later than me, even though he was a year older, because his father couldn't even afford to send him to England, which was not very expensive in those days. And so his vice-chancellor had to send him from Chandigarh. And so he was indebted to his vice-chancellor. And he came out, 1 year later after doing his MA. And he was there, and we used to discuss this, and we became very friendly. And at that time, His simplicity went so far that he used to, you know how, maybe if you're lucky you don't know, except in theory, how cold and damp England is. And so we were all shivering, you know, and we were in the same corridor in St. John's College in Cambridge. And he used to get up at 4 in the morning, given his peasant background, and then take a cold shower while we were all closing windows, you know, more bourgeois, better off kids. And I said, this man is going to go far. But I didn't realize he would become the Prime Minister right there. So he basically was, we used to discuss it, and you know, our trajectories took different turns. I became a scholar, writing about these things, and you know, in different ways. And he became a man of action and implementation. So he basically told me many times that we would like to do all these other things, but I have no money. Because at one time, he was in the Reserve Bank, and then he was writing to the finance minister, to Murashidai, and so on and so forth. And that was the constraint, that once you start growing, then you begin to get more money. Then you can spend it on all the nice things, the second stage of reform, which I call track 2 or stage 2 reform. Just until you've successfully done the first part and gotten the economy going, and which also has direct effects on the poor, you cannot also do the second set of things, where you ahead. Now you might say, why don't you redistribute right away? And the constraint is what I told you from Professor Galetsky, that there's just so much poverty, you cannot really redistribute. This doesn't apply to countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or something. They have oil wealth. If money is flowing through their ears, then the question is, should they not be spending money on redistribution right away? We are not in that problem. We weren't in that kind of situation. We had to grow first and then come to it. And this is exactly, those of you who are following international events like Brazil, whose leader was President Lula, after President Cardoso, who was a professor of sociology, who wrote against globalization, but once he got in to be the president, he was in for globalization in a very big way. When President Cardoso went in for globalization, growth began to take off. When that growth took off, they got the revenues. So there was an interview with his successor, Mrs. Dildorf, or I forget her name, and she was saying that we are now in a position to spend money on employment schemes, on all sorts of direct schemes in order to improve welfare. But she's then talking exactly like we do, or we should be thinking about what we are doing now, which is that unless President Cardoso had done the pro-growth things, measures, there would have been no President Lula to be able to do the stage 2 reform. And we're exactly in that phase because a lot of us, including the Gujarat government, were for growth, were for efficient policies, which produce the prosperity, which then enables us to do the other things without having to go and somehow grab money from somewhere or the other, all right? Which really doesn't grow on trees, as we know. So I think that is the way in which to view what is going on. Now, what is happening now is that a lot of these things which we are trying to do now, like healthcare, education, minimum employment, which has a problem, I'll discuss it. These are not like changing, say, labor laws, which we haven't been able to in most parts of the country, or reducing a trade barrier, opening up the economy. That creates political problems of getting the lobbies, which are all entrenched around the old model of autarkic, inward-looking development. Those are political problems, and I would not underemphasize that, particularly in the presence of a chief minister and all your bureaucrats as well. That is difficult enough, but at the political level, all right? Because all these lobbies, and first we have the wrong ideas about how we must have autarkic development, we must have self-sufficiency to the point where we just have a counterproductive policy framework, we get low growth. So around that, all these lobbies grow up. Then we economists change our minds and say, no, all this is terrible. So So you should now, we go and tell the politicians, you should now dismantle tariffs, you should change a variety of things. But around the role model, lobbies have grown up, interest groups have grown up, and the politician then has to negotiate a democratic setup how to get around these things. So it's necessarily going to be a slow process. But that is a different point from saying, how do we do this track 2 or stage 2 reforms where we are spending monies which we have generated on all these others, directly going to the poor in terms of healthcare, education, etc. Because those are what we call in economics social engineering problems. Take education. Should it be private education, public education? What should be the optimal size of classes? How do we get students to attend? How do we get teachers to attend? This is not like a straightforward economic policy problem, okay? And that's where a great deal of experimentation, sophistication, learning from experience, learning from the experience of others, learning, what I call learning by doing of others, learning by undoing of yet others, and then, trying to put it into your own context, the way we were discussing with you in the afternoon, which you're very, very much into doing. That is where we are at now, in my opinion. And to me, that's a more complex task where we have to have an open mind. We have to be able to learn from the variety of experiences of different countries, and then be willing to experiment and change course as we go down that particular route. So I think that is one thing I would like to emphasize, because Gujarat, and I now appreciate even more, is very much into doing these things right now. And I think that is quite admirable. I think it's a mistake to believe that Gujarat is just into growth. Because after all, except for me, everybody is a businessman, I guess. I'm supposed to be the failure in my family. Because everywhere, people get into commerce, get into, doing things which advance the economy, advance business, and so on. Professional work is where some of us are, and it seems to me that the public image of Gujarat has been deliberately cultivated, contrary to what I was saying about our growing dominance in arts and sciences, has been that we are like a national shopkeepers or national industrialists, CEOs, and managing directors, and so on. But we are actually now very much into social entrepreneurship and so on, which I think is really, we are into that phase 2 in a very dramatic way. And I think that's something I think, Merit, you want to add, bring out more, because having studied Gujarat's experience and talked to the Chief Minister before this talk, I realized that Gujarat is not correctly portrayed as being concentrated only on the conventional reforms and going in for growth. It is in fact walking on both legs. The second leg is made possible by the first leg, because if you didn't have the first reforms which lead to growth, you would not be able to. There is no way of getting the second one. And actually, Pranab Mukherjee, 3 years ago or 2 years ago, when I gave a lecture in the Lok Sabha, I saw him in saying somewhere that we've had too much concentration on growth, and we ought to do, inclusive, measures by which he meant health, education. And I told his advisor, who was an economist, I said, this is exactly the wrong thing. He doesn't realize that he could not do the second set of reforms, health, education, etc., unless he's the first stage. So he's got to intensify, broaden, and so on, do a variety of things which still need to be done, because, to change the kind of policy framework which we had before the 91 reforms started in earnest, it's like cleaning up after a cyclone. It's a thankless but almost an endless job. You can't do it very quickly in reality, because you've got to encounter lobbies. There are so many areas where it has penetrated, like the BP oil spill. That model is everywhere, and you have to unsettle it bit by bit in a democratic framework. And so the job still remains. You take the amount of trade restrictions in the system. The industrial tariffs were about 110%. in 1991, very high average industrial tariffs or manufacturing tariffs. Right now, they're in the range of 10 to 11%, which is still high by international standards. And that happened gradually, which I believe in, because you can't do things in a big rush without unsettling everything and unsettling your own government, because you'll be voted out of power if you go too fast, much too fast, and so on. So that is something which we have actually been doing. It still has to be intensified. But unless we actually keep doing it, the finance minister could not really do and sustain the second stage of reform, where increasing revenues keep coming from improved growth. Now he's staying. I just read last year, we already begun, because I did criticize the public, and I suppose at least economists read economists, and economists who are close to government may have conveyed it to him. Now he talks in a very different way. Talks about how growth is important, efficiency is important, and how, therefore, then that will enable you to spend money on healthcare and so on. And that is where, as I said, the focus is at the moment. So I think that's one set of things I would like to sort of, I thought this was a lesson which Gujarat needed more than it needed to teach, but having now studied Gujarat and what's been happening in your system, you're pretty well aware of it, and you're experimenting on track 2 reforms and trying to get them right, and this is a very important part of your agenda, which I think is admirable, because we're probably earlier on this than in many other countries. The second thing I want to say is that, as we dismantle this regime of, what Rajaji calls, or CR as we used to call him, the license permit Raj, he was the one who created that phrase, that generated essentially the corruption. Because in the beginning it was a product of the economists saying we must husband our resources, we must have the government do everything. Because that seems like a common sense point of view, that when you're behind the curve, you should be intervening in everything. Everything is scarce. But you realize pretty soon that's the way you behave, you will make matters a lot worse. That you've got to choose where you want to intervene and stick to it strictly, but instead it grew and grew and grew into a Frankenstein, which we all know, and which then had to be dismantled. But the effect of that on governance, on corruption, was that bureaucrats, in my experience, high-level bureaucrats, do not take money. Some might, but generally, it's a different kind of patronage system that develops with industry and so on, with which you are dealing, more one of power, indulging your ego, getting your son maybe a job or something like that. But it's not really corruption in a very strong sense. But the politicians who have to raise money, generally for politics, they see this as a cash cow, as it is called. So they wind up doing this. Now, of course, there's a joke actually about as the system proliferated and politicians became wedded to it, and corruption therefore grew because they could collect money to give licenses to people whom they should not give it to. They should use independent criteria. And usually you would have, like the G2 scam, the guy who gets it splitting the profits with the guy who gives it. All right? So it's a profit sharing or a corruption sharing way of doing it. If you had reforms in the telecom sector or in the mining sector, which have not been very successful and done very well, you would have much less of the G2 scam and so on. So actually it's a lack of reforms in that area which actually leads to continuation of the old style corruption, where people are actually selling licenses. So this is a kind of corruption where you have essentially people being rewarded or people taking bribes to do what they're not supposed to do. They're not supposed to give licenses that way. And that spread then to another type of corruption in the system, where low-level bureaucrats would start collecting bribes just to get you a birth certificate or a land title, a death certificate for the family, all kinds of things, which they're supposed to do. So they should be, but they could collect a little some money from you each time you do that. That's what the Chinese used to do in the Ming Dynasty. The judges who were prosecutors as well and detectives and so on, they used to actually, their salaries were kept low and they collected a fee basically from the people they served. But this sounds like a fee, but it turns easily into people becoming cynical about that corruption and resenting it. But this is a case where low-level people are asking for bribes to do what they're supposed to do. Whereas against the other ones, where the people are getting bribes to do what they're not supposed to do. So these are two very different types of corruption that have grown in the system, largely due to starting with the license permit Raj. And so I distinguish between two ways of mitigating, of addressing corruption. One is, and I draw from the climate change literature, since Chief Minister is interested in green and the green economy and doing something about it. So one is called mitigation, like you reduce carbon emissions to begin with. And the other is called adaptation, meaning once the carbon emissions happen, how do you adapt to them to minimize the problems that they raise? I think we have to concentrate on mitigation. Things like Lokpal are ways of adapting to the thing, to corruption once it has arisen. I think the mitigation strategy is reducing the license permit Raj, extending those kinds of reforms which are more market-oriented, which eliminate corruption at source, reducing the incentive for that. So that is something I've been arguing in a substantial way, and in the lecture I gave 2 days ago in Vidyangavan, of which I've left a copy, I was developing that theme, saying that if you want to address corruption, first break it down into at least these two different types, and the way to deal with the second one, where clerks demand money, is simply to replace them with automated machines and so on, where you just, like an ATM, I don't know what it's called in India, but a cash machine or something like that, where you can use the IT technology and you just put in your money and maybe use Nandan Nilekani's ID card, which is again using science, and then whatever you want to get out of it. Of course, the unions in the public sector will try and stop it, but then you can have an incentive scheme under which you can handle it. Sheila Dixit in Delhi has a punishment scheme, which may be a bit harder if the sector is unionized, but that's the direction in which to go. But the way to handle the top-level corruption is to extend the market-oriented reforms. And I think also in politics, since right now politicians are so used to having to raise money through licenses and so on, the way to do it, I think, is to do what the Americans do, but not necessarily in the same way, which is to say, we let you raise money in legal ways. Because if you don't let them raise money in legal ways to finance the political campaigns, they're going to one way or the other raise it in illegal ways. They'll create the mechanisms through which they'll sell, that extract money from the private sector. So I think that's another reform that we need, but I think that's the way I would think about it. And I think since Nitish Kumar and Narendra Rai are the two people who are highlighted all the time, and correctly, for being totally incorruptible. That's great, but the system has to be incorruptible, right? Because you are unique in some ways, and there are theories as to why you are. But we can discuss them over tea or something, because they're clever theories, but probably silly clever theories. But the point is, you are honest, and that is important also because that sets an example of the ethos. That's very important in any system, because if you see that the guy at the top is corrupt, well, I mean, then everything goes. But if you say, here is someone who is absolutely incorruptible, that makes a lot of difference, and that ethos passes down. But still, incentives matter, and therefore we have to change the system in some way, and that's what we have to worry about, so that the average person behaves ethically, not the exceptional person who made a leader like you. So I think that is the one lesson which we have, which I have to offer to Gujarat, which is actually a leader in the fight against corruption, at least from the top. And I think this is extremely important. The other thing, since I have about 15 minutes or 10, 15 minutes, or should I stop? Yeah, I just think there are two things which again are very relevant to Gujarat's experience and actually have come out of it in a way. And this is the fact that society can become extremely unstable if you have at the class level, meaning class harmony between poor and rich. If the rich exhibit a lot of excess, conspicuous consumption, and building extravagant weddings and ostentatious displays, if you just hide it, nobody knows you're excessively rich. But if you're flaunting it, then it becomes a problem, particularly if the aspirations of the poor are aroused and cannot be satisfied fully at any point of time. Because in the nature of the case, aspirations are beyond, you're chasing them up. So if you have a lot of poverty, and as people are improving, and they see, a lot of wealth being displayed, that is an unhealthy, unstable combination. So I've been talking about how we want, for a stable society, a slogan saying less excess and more access. And that combination is really what we need to have to contain the social discontent which can arise. So as aspirations arise, I think the politicians are feeling the pressure too, in terms of increased aspirations. Because until about 91, I would say, because the reforms were still pending, they were beginning in small ways under Rajiv Gandhi, but nothing really happened in a significant way until 91, when Prime Minister Rao brought in Manmohan Singh as his technical advisor, as a finance minister. Then it began in earnest. And then the BJP government did it in even greater earnest under Prime Minister Vajpayee. They really carried it forward. And then we've had a period of stagnation under the UPA government for a variety of reasons that we know. So you have had, the changes coming in since 91, and that has led to a great deal of impact on the people's incomes. There's a lot of evidence now that growth has been inclusive. It could have been more inclusive, but it has been inclusive. It has lifted about 200 million people above the poverty line, whereas before they were just increasing because of the lack of growth, there was nothing happening. So I have called it the revolution of perceived possibilities. Now the people are conscious that they can get something more. Before they were like Oliver Twist and Charles Dickens, who asked for more and got less, right? If you read your Charles Dickens. Now they ask for more, and if you don't give it to them, they turn you out. And there's a lot of evidence of that happening actually. So there is this revolution of perceived possibilities, what we used to call the revolution of rising expectation. But in the Indian context, where we have all the elements of a liberal democracy, like a relatively free press, I would say, meaning, it's not like China in all of these dimensions where everything is tightly controlled. Then you've got opposition parties, you've got civil society, you've got a relatively independent judiciary. 4 elements of a democracy, a liberal democracy. Not all of them perfect, of course, but they're better than nothing, okay? And so that enables these economic aspirations to be translated into politically effective demand, which then the politicians feel pressure from. In China, you have none of these elements, so as their aspirations have also increased as a result of their growth, which is even higher than ours, What do? They go into the streets, have what are called social disruptions. And very likely most of them get put away, poor fellows, somewhere or the other by an authoritarian system. That's a highly unstable system also. But in our case, this is what's happening. But at the same time, it is necessarily a slow process. They get something now, they want something, but the pace at which they can get it is still constrained, in all sorts of ways. But that's definitely happening under what I call the track 2 reforms. And in Gujarat, it's happening even more, thanks to your leadership and interest in these measures. But where this is happening, and then they see excess consumption, flaunting of displays and displays of wealth, that creates automatically attention, right? And that is something which can undermine the class cohesion and so on. You see that in the United States much more, because in the United States, of course it's a grown, developed economy, but the wages, which affects about 30% also of the bottom, have been stagnant for the last 25, 30 years. There's a lot of debate about what exactly caused it, but the fact is that they have remained stagnant. And then they see all these people in the financial sector earning literally billions, like in 1 week, through a merger and acquisition, they will produce more income than even CEOs, chief executive officers, CEOs or managing directors in the manufacturing sector, who will make maybe, like the Enron guys, $150 million a year. And that's a mind-boggling figure. But that's money that the financial sector will make in 1 week, probably half a week. Enormous wealth. And then they display it. You have to walk down Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue in New York, and then the stores a little further down. So first the trucks are always unloading all kinds of furniture and, for children's parties, which cost $100,000. It was like a little casual field work, asking them what's going on, what are they doing. And further down there is a store called F.O. Schwartz, where you can buy gigantic pandas and so on for $150,000, electric trains for $300,000. That is luxury consumption, and that excess is really what makes. If nobody knew these guys were doing things, if they were just buying a castle in Europe or something a day, they wouldn't know anything about it. But they end up bringing it right down. So that is creating a big tension, as you know, at this Occupy Wall Street demonstration and so on. So they talk of this being the 1% and they being the 99%. Actually, it's a misnomer from the point of view of international situation. Because all these people are agitated. Very likely have refrigerators, cars, air conditioners, So they're part of the 1% in world income distribution. They may be part of the 99% in the US income. So in a sense, it's rather odd to see a bunch of people talking about income distribution and keeping the poor countries out of their purview, and even talking about stopping outsourcing, which creates jobs abroad and so on. So, but none of these movements, as we know, even from Delhi, right, are coherent. They're just expressions of discontent, which is all over the place. And that discontent can be socially explosive. And that's where I think the Gujarat model, both traditionally and yours, is extremely important. And that is the old giant Calvinist model. We accumulate capital, like the Burgers in Netherlands. There's a book by my colleague Simon Sharma called The Embarrassment of Riches. And he documents how, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the burghers, who were the merchants and the accumulated wealth, but they never spent it on self-indulgence. They always spent it for public good. And that is actually our traditional model, in my view, that much of the textile wealth, for instance, in the city was spent on, not on, building fancy things, on, excessive consumption. It was spent back on education, health, even dry farming experiments, as we know, were often carried out by the billionaires. And I remember running into Kasturbai once. He never paid anybody 1 penny more in his factories than the market rate. But whatever money he made, he never spent on himself. He looked very simple. When my father died, he had come to visit. It was just a small car. He looked like he could be a clerk in his own outfit. But the money was being spent on social goods. That's true of the Vikram Sarabhai's parents and himself and so on. That is the model which I think is Gujarat's legacy, and that's really, I see it most within India, in Gujarat actually. And that is that is exactly what we want. That wealth must be accumulated. Without that, you can't affect poverty and bring public good to the people. That part is very important, and that's where the left-wing populist fallacies, think accumulating capital is no good and so on and so forth. That really is the wrong. Yeah. So there we are right, and we are also right in walking on the other leg, which is to say we're going to use this money for personal social responsibility. In the old days, there were no corporations. There were just families making money. So they just automatically, it was their money and they spent it. Today, corporations make the money, and then we say corporations should do something. But basically, that second part is what's really necessary. That we really want to do that part. And then once the aspirations are aroused, we wanted to make it possible for people to benefit from the prosperity. And the classic way to do it is just to give them access through education to the mainstream development in the economy. And that is what gives them income with which they can spend on good things. It's not, we need additional measures there. As Gandhiji also made us familiar with, I can get more income, but then I can go and spend it on drinking. And this is another case where the gender issue is supposed to be quite important. There are studies which show that if the money goes to the woman, she spends it on education for the children and looking after them, whereas the men typically go off and spend it on drinking, etc. So in the long run, it may be that women may then wind up going to the pub as well and drinking and so on. But at least immediately they act like traditional women, and they go ahead and spend it for good purposes. And then you can use what we call in economics today nudging, meaning creating through educational process, trying to get people to spend money which they receive through the income process on good things and so on. And then we also have policies which I think you've already implemented, which are fortifying the foods with proteins and all kinds of nutrients, which is actually a very cheap thing to do and has a huge payoff. And that is something where you don't rely on the people and education to do the right thing from the point of view of their families and themselves. And education has become extremely expensive. $50,000 in private colleges, all the best ones which produce the elite groups who go into government and so on. Who can afford that with stagnant income? They can barely pay even $5,000. So they don't get educated. And that creates two classes, basically, and resentments, and a class struggle. So I think this is really a very important way where I think the Gujarat tradition, I think, of what I call Jain and Calvinist approach to creating wealth and spending it for good, and using modern technologies in order to improve the access to education, etc., is going to be important. I mean, one particular thing which I was talking with Dr. Sivo on this, and because there's something happening all over, that typically the costs in education, certainly in higher education, have gone up for one simple reason, that we don't use modern technology. I mean, I still stand in front of a blackboard. My wife is more advanced, actually, than I am in her lecture. But I stand in front of the blackboard, and we are all asked to teach 15 students. Now, I mean, an average salary, we are supposed to teach 3 courses. So each course, given our you know, salaries and the perks and so on, is about $150,000 for about 15 kids, 15 people. That's a lot of money. So that pushes up the cost of education. If you could really use modern technology, interactive technology and so on, you could have a class, like she has one class of 250 students, you know, you could teach at least 45, 50 students and actually do a better job, you know, in terms of interacting with. That would cut down the cost dramatically. Because in the end, even the United States has a big budget constraint. They don't have money to spend anymore. So how are they going to handle the education of the poor? Because how much money can the universities come out with by giving them scholarships and so on, or the government? So ultimately you've got to use technology to, you know, and that was what Vikram Sarabhai did also with TV and satellite and so on. It made it possible to use science to get to the masses and so on. So science, which is what Panditji had also emphasized in a big way, is also an important ingredient, and I'm glad that we are building up in Gujarat that element also, to be able to come up with interesting ideas of reducing costs and increasing productivity. The last point I'll make is about, and I think this is where, you know, this whole objection to the BT cotton and the BT brinjal and the GM foods. And many people think GM foods are some General Motors, you know, a new car or something. You know, but it is. Those are the modern green revolution. The first green revolution under Dr. Borlaug, you know, has been absorbed. There's nothing more to be had. But this is the second green revolution. And I'm not talking about green revolution in climate change. That's a different kind of green. So here I'm talking about the seeds. If we don't have that, then we're not going to get that. We're going to be able to increase productivity in agriculture, which affects the poor almost directly right in the rural areas. We're not going to get that just because we fear some potential Frankenstein food or, you know, sort of sprawling around. And you can get very, you know, high cost increment in productivity and in affecting the poor in the rural areas, one important element. So we really have to fight it, in my opinion, and because there's no scientific evidence for it. And I think in a way, my good friend Jairam Ramesh, who I've known for many years, I think he was wrong the way I saw it from abroad, because he had a scientific committee pointing out that there was practically no scientific evidence that these were dangerous foods. You can have a monitoring agency to see if something begins to go wrong, then you stop it, right? It's not an irreversible decision, in my opinion, like some can be. So instead, what does he do? He then, you know, Vikram Sarabhai's son, I don't know if he's here, Kartikeya, he's run some sort of environmental thing, so he takes Kartikeya along to town hall meetings. And in town hall meetings, only people who rant and rave against the seeds come. And he didn't carry any scientists to refute those things. So again, you know, then he had to succumb to it. And I think it was completely mismanaged in that way. It seems to, and Dr. Swaminathan also sort of went along with it a little bit, because he actually supervised the translation of the first revolution seeds into the countryside with the extension service and so on. And he said, these are now being produced by, not by the public sector, but by private firms, which, you know, have a big incentive in just selling them regardless of the consequences. And we don't have any liability laws, tort liability, meaning if you damage somebody, you can be taken to court for damages. And my reaction to that was, today, because of NGOs, because everybody's conscious, if you were to do some golmaal, as we say in Gujarati, or hanky-panky, and, you know, behave in a shabby way, and really take people for a ride at expense to them, they will have hell to pay in terms of reputation costs. It is simply, so today we don't necessarily need tort action, etc. It is simply the reputation loss will be so immense it would cost you a hell of a lot. And so I think the this is one area where I think Gujarat certainly can play a role, because we do have, I think, the right attitude generally towards agricultural productivity, absorbing new know-how. This is science again. So I think unless we harness science in the ways in which I think Gujarat has traditionally done and is doing right now, there's very little hope of being able to sustain a very high growth rate, in my judgment. Because you really have to have the impulse continuously of better and better technology. That alone can keep the system driving in a big way. And if that begins to decelerate because of a variety, because you're not managing things like the new seeds and so on well, then you, or the educational process and reducing the cost of providing education by using modern technology, then the excess of the poor to, getting a better deal in life is going to be compromised. So I would say that this is something we need to do. In my lecture in Vigyan Bhavan, I said maybe the Prime Minister, and I would say the same to you for Narendra Bhai, that we need to have a slogan, less excess and more access, turn it into a slogan and put it at the back of every Gujarati nano car, which is a people's car. And, that really should be the message. And that is a Gujarati message also. Completely consistent with our old Jain values and the things which Gandhiji exploited. So I think I would just end on that Gujarat note with your permission. Thank you very much.